I love this thing. Picasso, wherever he was and wherever his studio was, he made this in 1911, 1912. This hung on the wall in his studio, wherever it was. And gallery curators and MoMA people would come and they'd ask him for it. And he said, no, as long as I'm alive, you can't have it. So they made a copy of it in steel and colored it to look like cardboard. It's made of cardboard. You know when you get a shirt back from the cleaners, it comes in they used to come in these cheap boxes. Well, he cut up the boxes to make this. And it's made of, I think, 5 pieces. And then it's stitched together. And so the MoMA had the steel one. And when he died, following his instructions, this was taken apart and sent to MoMA, and it sat in their archives for 40 years because it was in an envelope and flat, and they didn't realize they had the original. So this, I mean, I would like to make a kit. I think I'd be rich, don't you? It has a single center, the circle. It has an armature, the street coming into the center. There's a piece of cardboard that comes up, bends and comes forward and tips this thing. And then it's got the strings, so it's telling you it's a guitar, but this goes down to the base of this tube, and this, the wires come to the top. So it's messing with your idea of what a city is or what a guitar is completely. You know it's a guitar, you recognize it right away. But it's a new kind of guitar. It doesn't play music, but it's a guitar in your head for sure. And then, how do you know it's a guitar? Well, like in Kevin Lynch, it has markers. It has the neck and the tuning stuff. It has the sound hole. It has the front board, and it has a back board, which actually folds forward. And then it has literally a box with this as a cylinder standing inside the depth of the box. And so you, in a funny way, you've got the front, the back, and the depth of the box, and you're seeing through the front into the sounding space of the guitar, and it's reflecting back out at you. It's an amazing idea. And so the question is, well, how do you know it's a guitar? It's all these symbolic elements are recombined into making this new form. And then the question is, well, if you're doing a city, this is what Rowe was thinking about, was how do you recombine the symbolic elements of a city into a new form? What would it be like? My disappointment, looks like just like it used to look like. It's not very new. This is a completely different thing. And the thing about Rowe was that he wrote about collage and layering the city, how you move through things. And he talked about transparency and objects that were in a field and could be very ambiguous. Is this the opening to the frontal plane of the guitar, or is it a cylinder standing inside the box? And so it's flipping backwards and forwards in your mind about exactly what it is, and yet at the same time it reads as a whole and is quite beautiful as an object. And if I sold you kits, you could really appreciate it. You'd have one right here. There's lots of stories about this guitar. I think I told you at Cooper some of them. They were drawing and drawing and drawing in the analytical cubist phase, and it got so hard, Braque decided to make himself a layered model of what they were drawing in real space, to make cutouts and layer it back. And he did it with a table, it was in a corner, and he did it with the table surface going up in false perspective, and then these things on it. And Picasso surprise visited him and said, "Oh, you're doing sculpture now? Okay." And this was the result. I mean, it's amazing. Well, for me, Heterotopia's work around, they're always, this is very different than Foucault, but it isn't in other ways. They're always very ambiguous. There always some sort of edge is involved in shifting between one way of doing things and another. You're not quite sure. And Rowe was onto this in terms of multiple scales in a building and so on, and layering. But heterotopias are on this edge between things. And they have simultaneously several different systems going on inside them. So there's a centering system, like in the City of Faith. There's a linear organization, like in the City Machine. But when you combine them together, you get a new hybrid that's neither. And that has to have a different kind of operating system that's much more reflexive and complex than either one of these two on their own. He describes it as like an information system, and it's exactly the way we talk about websites now, that the number of connections you have, you are rated up and down, and so you're shifting in the flow of information according to how many people visit your site. He talked about it in terms of traffic in a traffic jam, how people try to move in flow, and you sort of knew where you were by watching the other cars in a dynamic set of relationships. And I think of it, I flip it over and say that in a city, there's urban actors working in the different patches, and they have dynamic relationships with each other, so different areas are always changing. Foucault was the professor of systems of thought in Paris. So a single center was very important system of thought around one important place. A dynamic binary system would be another system of way of doing things. That was the early scientific system and perspective and so on. And then this is a new emerging system that he wrote in 1968 about this in terms of heterotopias and spatial systems. And he gave the traffic jam example. This is the cha-cha-cha diagram that I used to use when I was teaching at Columbia. And the students called it the cha-cha-cha diagram because the initial, in the centering system, the heterotopia, there's a dominant center that represses the other and makes it hidden. So the heterotopia contains the other, but within a facade that hides it. Then the people, say, in the hospital get fed up with it. They can't do their experiments. The disease is still killing everybody in the city. So they move the hospital outside, and they can have proper pavilions, proper sanitation, all the scientific modernity they want, and they can have a nice, fast connection into the cities. This one is very sort of gentle and kind and porous in certain ways, unless there's the plague, in which case, like in Ebola, they're making people stay in their houses, and now they're shutting whole districts and whole cities, so that you just shut it down. In this one, you move out, and you have the new science city. It's the classic binary system, old and new. And then in this one, old and new are all mixed together, and there's a mobility between old and new that's making a completely new kind of city, which is like the new kind of guitar we were looking at. In here, this is like in here I have the original city, and then the growth of the city out around the armature with a direction of growth. Cities very often have a direction of growth. People start to feel that this scientific city isn't good. They can have their satellite, their mobile, their car, but that mobility infects back inside the city and even into the core. And then it has these new centers which are specially equipped to handle this mobility and process information. You know this all, right? That the prisoners had to wear face masks when they were in the yard so they wouldn't recognize each other. They weren't allowed to speak to each other. Even when they went to prayer, they weren't allowed to see each other. And their rooms all looked at this central tower, and these were lit and heated, and they had bathrooms even, and sort of primitive air conditioning, far better than where anybody lived at the time. But there were single cells with very thick walls, so you were supposed to be isolated as an individual and think about what you'd done bad and feel like you were watched at all times. Does this sound familiar? Big Brother.